Hello.
Oh, how nice. It's much easier when people respond. There are too many times in life where you do speak like I am, just speaking into the void. Nobody is listening, nobody is answering back. But this is a good start. My name is Hisham, I'm a psychiatrist, I'm a neuroscientist, and I do some teaching for medical students. And when you teach medical students, they tell you, well, this is the way you prepare a lecture, right? What you essentially structure the lecture as is, you tell them what you're going to tell them, then you actually tell them, and then you tell them what you told them. And the thing that interests me is, that is such a bloody low standard. You don't even have the hope that what you tell them will be exciting or scintillating enough. You've already resigned yourself to the fact that I'll tell them stuff, and at the end of it I'll have to tell them that this is what I told them. Right? Now, it doesn't work like that in other avenues. So, let us consider sex. I mean, at some point, some of us have. You tell them what you're going to do. You do what you said you were going to do. Now, if that isn't enough, then you've got to do the third step. It's probably not worth hanging around for the review. So now what I'm going to do in this set is, in a little while, I'm going to do a little bit about Twitter and food addiction. And then I'm going to do that bit on Twitter and food addiction. And hopefully that will work. So I'm going to come back and see what I've done. Okay, so now I almost didn't make it here. On the way here, I nearly got lost, and I couldn't look up the destination in Google Maps because I was texting. And in my despair, I beseeched, Lord, give me a sign. And lo and behold, the Lord did give me a sign. And the sign said, Grantham, 20 miles. Now, there will be some non-believers who will challenge that view and say that actually it is the government that, through an underfunded Department of Transport, gave you that sign. It was not the Lord. And to them I will say, I don't believe in government. In a nutshell, that is basically the explanation of most of America and Trumpocalypse 2016. The point I wanted to make was about hypotheses, right? And you can see how I jumped from that to this, and it's almost a seamless link. Now, as scientists, we're very big on data. Data is the thing that you really want. But of course, data is essentially about testing hypotheses or generating hypotheses. And most of you have probably done some statistics at some point, and what you do is you formulate a hypothesis, you collect some data, and then you do the necessary statistic to see whether you can actually validate your hypothesis. Right? Now, the way you actually set up in statistics is that you have a null hypothesis that says, I'm not going to find any difference in my experiment. And if you've got enough data to reject the null hypothesis, then you can say, I've actually got a finding here. Right? There are other ways in which you can reject the null hypothesis. And I'm going to tell you about a particular field I've been involved in for the last few years, and this is an area of food addiction. Now, the thing is, I don't study food addiction, I just criticize people who do. And basically, people who believe in food addiction say this is a thing. And I've written a few papers saying this isn't a thing. And sadly, this has become my most notable scientific work. So the epitaph on the gravestone of my scientific career is going to say, he said a thing wasn't a thing. Believers in food addiction are convinced that this is a thing. So they have a hypothesis, and they have data that supports that hypothesis, right? Now, this is the interesting thing about data and hypothesis. You can always find the data that you need to fit your hypothesis, and that's as far as you need to look. If the data doesn't fit your hypothesis, you still have the option of rejecting the null hypothesis. And the way you do that, well, one way you do that is by saying, well, screw you, null hypothesis! I don't care what you say! You pretend that everything is okay and you carry on. And that happens a lot more often than you think. The other way you can reject the hypothesis is that you can reject all the counter-hypotheses. Right? I will just believe in the Lord. I'm not going to believe in government. And therefore, no counter-hypothesis is going to be valid. Or you can reject people who present a counter-hypothesis. And this is where we get to the bit about Twitter and food addiction. Finally. So, our last paper, we wrote about the idea of sugar addiction. Now, sugar addiction has actually been in the pipeline, well, it's been in the background, in the foreground of the States for quite a long while, even before our born-again Italian Jamie Oliver entered the scene. Right? And sugar is sort of the ideal candidate for something that might be addictive. Way back in the 70s, people were writing Pure, White and Deadly, which is essentially, sounds like it's about cocaine, but it's actually about sugar. And we sat and looked at all the stuff that people have done about food addiction, sugar addiction, and wrote a paper and said, well, basically there is really nothing out there to say that sugar addiction is a thing. Now, as a proper scientist, you never write a paper saying there's nothing to say this is a thing. You say, well, there is the possibility that this could be a thing, but till you test it out properly, we can't really say it's a thing. And then what you do is you come somewhere like here, where you can say quite dogmatically, it's not a thing. It's really not a thing. So we wrote this paper, put it out there, and then I had one of my students who actually wrote the paper, and she posted it on her Twitter feed, because that's the kind of thing I believe people do nowadays. And this is the first time I've had somebody who's posted something on my behalf on Twitter, so that was very nice. And then she got trolls, right? And that happens even when you publish scientific papers. And there were a couple of trolls who were quite nasty to her. One of them actually was another scientist, and she got pretty pissed off, and she wanted to respond. And I said, look, that's not really the professional and honorable thing to do. Right? We really should be polite, we should keep a good face. So what I did was I just calmed her down and then saved it out for 5 months to bring here and then talk about it in an honorable way and take the piss out of people on stage. Right? So this has essentially been brewing for 5 months. When I look at it, I'm kind of disappointed by how little it's fermented. I'll give it to you. Because we wrote the stuff on sugar addiction, a person wrote in, was one of the Twitter trolls said, well, this article's turned up in an issue that's being part funded by somebody who's got money from the food industry. Ergo, everything you say is therefore suspect. We can reject everything because there is food industry connection here. So my student wrote back and said, well, please look at our conflict of interest statement. We haven't taken any money from the food industry. This is all independent, and we don't even have a research interest in this area. And he wrote back and said, well, I'm still not convinced that this would have made it had it not been for the food industry involvement. And she wrote back and said, well, come on, look, what are you thinking? That Big Sugar has managed to hijack the editorial team of this tiny, low-impact journal? I'm fairly convinced that actually the review process must have been standard, and this would have been subject to the same scrutiny that any paper would be. And he wrote back and said, standard and poor. Right? And then he added, sorry, I couldn't resist the pun. Now this is the bit that I stopped myself from sending there, and that I'm now going to say. Because I want to write back and say, don't be so hard on yourself. You did resist. There is no fucking pun there. Now, the only way I can convey this to him is by, hopefully posting this on YouTube, and then he'll see it. But it'll be too late for him to come back on that thread. Right? Here's the second troll. The second troll wrote to my student directly and said, be careful of who you publish with. Because the person you publish with has published with other people who have got money from the food industry. What he's essentially saying is that industry sponsorship is contagious. You can catch it by having your name on the same paper as somebody else who's had it. Now this is making things very complicated because every time you go and give a talk, you have to give you a big declaration of interest. I have no conflict of interest to report, I have not received money. And now, my conflict of interest takes about half the talk. I've written this paper with this person, who's written this paper with this person, and who's also written this paper with this person, and that person got money. So we're kind of fourth conflict of interest once removed. But actually, that person, I think, was a good example of a very different kind of hypothesis formation. Because that is, I think, first-class conspiracy theory hypothesis, right? That by association there is a link that is followed through that speaks of something larger and more sinister in the background. And here is one small example of that. That person we tried to get back to, and what did he do? He blocked us, right? Arse. He controlled her, and then he blocked her. Right? Now, there's nothing we can do about him, but we did find out that this is what he does. Now, clearly you can see where all your research money is going. We're sitting and tracking trolls on Twitter. And then when we can't find them, we're saving them up on a to-do list to say, talk about Twitter troll on Bright Club in 5 months' time. I'm going to finish at one point about hypotheses, that you can always formulate a hypothesis to make it seem plausible. So, the food addiction world goes, obesity is such a major problem, there are so many energy-dense, unhealthy foods out there, and we can't stop ourselves eating them, therefore it must be addictive, right? And that's the kind of thing you listen to and say, hang on, what? But if you frame it that way, you can get things quite far before anybody actually questions it. And if you set the premise up, anything, no matter how ridiculous, can seem reasonable. And I'll leave you with an example of that. When it comes to microwavable popcorn, buttered is the best flavor for when you're watching porn. That's correct. It makes sense. What the fuck are you doing eating popcorn while watching porn? That's how you set up the premise that allows you to test any hypothesis you want.